You owe us $6,000 for managing your abandoned property. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After 8 months away, I come home to find this psycho woman, Karen, had taken over my family cabin like she owned the place. She's waving legal documents in my face, screaming about liens and lawsuits, acting like I'm the criminal here. The whole neighborhood turned against me. People I'd known for years suddenly treating me like garbage. I was exhausted, furious, and completely blindsided. But when I discovered what Karen had really been doing, she lost her mind so spectacularly that 3 separate meltdowns weren't enough. Ever had someone try to steal everything from you? Let me back up. 8 months earlier, I'd gotten the call every adult child dreads. Mom had stage 4 cancer, and the doctors in Denver gave her maybe 6 months. So, I packed up my life, took leave from my consulting job, and moved into her apartment to be her caregiver. Those months were the hardest of my life, watching this vibrant woman who raised me single-handedly just fade away. The medical bills were crushing, $40,000 even with insurance. By the time we laid her to rest in May, I was emotionally shattered and financially drained. All I wanted was to retreat to our family cabin in Pine Valley, Colorado, and figure out how to rebuild my life. That Tuesday afternoon in mid-May, I drove up the winding mountain road expecting peace and quiet. Instead, I found this professional-looking woman in her mid-40s setting up equipment next to a white business van labeled Pine Valley Management Services. She had this whole setup, official folder, business cards, even a contractor's tool belt. The confidence in her movements told me this wasn't her first rodeo. "Mr. Johnson," she called out, not even seeming surprised to see me. "I'm Karen Willis from Pine Valley Management Services. Your property required emergency management during the extended abandonment period." She handed me an itemized invoice that made my jaw drop. $6,000 in management fees, plus $800 in late penalties. The paperwork looked completely legitimate: professional letterhead, detailed line items for lawn maintenance, security monitoring, even pest control services. But here's what really got me. At the bottom was what looked like my signature authorizing these services. I'd never seen this woman in my life, never hired any management company, never signed anything. "This is fraud," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen didn't even blink. She pulled out a thick folder and started laying documents on my truck's hood like she was dealing cards. Business license, liability insurance certificate, county contractor permits. She had an answer for everything. "Sir, Colorado Revised Statute 38-12-204 requires professional oversight of abandoned residential properties exceeding 6 months, she said, rattling off the law like she'd memorized it. We followed all legal procedures and filed the appropriate notices with Pine County. The scariest part? She actually seemed to believe what she was saying. This wasn't some tweaker trying to pull a fast one. This was a sophisticated operation. I called the Pine County Sheriff, absolutely certain this would be resolved in minutes. Deputy Miller showed up, reviewed Karen's paperwork, and basically shrugged. "This appears to be a legitimate business dispute, sir. You'll need a civil court if you want to challenge it." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Here I was, barely a month after burying my mother, dealing with someone trying to steal my family's property with what looked like legitimate legal authority. Karen smiled, not mean-spirited, just professional, and handed me more paperwork. "Non-payment triggers automatic lien filing within 15 business days, she explained, as if she were doing me a favor by warning me. "I've left you our Know Your Rights pamphlet and contact information for payment arrangements." She packed up her equipment with the same methodical precision she'd used to set it up, loaded everything into her van, and drove off like this was just another Tuesday at the office. That evening, I sat on my deck staring at the paperwork, trying to process what had happened. My phone kept buzzing with worried texts from friends, asking how I was adjusting to life without Mom, but I couldn't even begin to explain this nightmare. The cabin felt different now, violated somehow. This place had been our family sanctuary for decades, where Mom taught me to fish, where I'd brought girlfriends to impress them with mountain sunsets, and where I'd planned to heal from the hardest months of my life. Now it felt like enemy territory. I kept looking at that signature on Karen's paperwork. It really did look like mine, not perfect, but close enough that I started second-guessing myself. Could I have signed something and forgotten? The grief and stress of Mom's illness had left me pretty scattered toward the end. The next morning brought another shock of a different kind. A county utility truck idled at the end of my road, the driver studying my cabin through binoculars before rolling away as soon as I stepped outside. There was no paperwork and no note, just the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Karen had shifted tactics from forms to pressure. I needed help, and I needed it fast. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. That photograph changed everything. It was a picture of my mother's grave, taken recently. I could tell because of the fresh flowers I'd left just 3 days earlier. But someone had placed a business card from Pine Valley Management Services right on top of the headstone. The message was crystal clear. Karen knew exactly where to hurt me. My hands were shaking as I called my old college buddy Tom, who had become a lawyer in Boulder. "Tom, I need your help. Someone's trying to steal my property, and they just threatened my mother's grave." 20 minutes later, he was on his way up the mountain. While I waited for Tom, my neighbor Mike Stevens knocked on my door. Mike's a good guy, retired Pine County Sheriff's deputy, who moved up here about the same time we got the cabin. He'd kept an eye on the place while I was in Denver with Mom. "Jack, I need to warn you about that woman who was here yesterday," he said, looking genuinely concerned. "Karen Willis isn't your typical scammer. She used to work for the Pine County Planning Department before she got into this property management business. The woman knows the legal system inside and out. That explained the professional setup and her confidence with the legal citations. But Mike had more disturbing news. She approached me about 2 years ago, wanted to recruit me for what she called community protection services, he continued. Tried to convince me that property values were at risk from absentee owners. Something about it felt wrong, too slick, too rehearsed. But her paperwork looked completely legitimate. Mike paused, choosing his words carefully. "The thing is, Jack, county records got really messy when they digitized everything back in 1975. Lots of old property deeds didn't transfer correctly into the new system. If someone knew where to look, they could probably find ways to exploit those gaps." My stomach dropped. If Karen had inside knowledge of county record-keeping problems, she could potentially challenge anyone's ownership. When Tom arrived, I showed him everything. Karen's invoice, the legal documents, and especially that photograph. His expression grew grimmer with each piece of evidence. "This is harassment and intimidation, but it's also incredibly sophisticated," he said, spreading the papers across my kitchen table. "She's not just trying to scam you out of $6,000. She's building a case to claim legitimate authority over your property." Tom pulled out his laptop and started researching. What he found 30 minutes later left us both speechless. According to the digitized county records, my family's cabin and the surrounding land showed unresolved ownership status, dating back to the 1970s reorganization. But Tom's a thorough lawyer, so he didn't stop there. He called Rebecca Hayes, the Pine County clerk, and asked her to pull the original paper records from the archives. What she found changed everything. "Mr. Johnson," Rebecca said over speakerphone, "your grandfather Samuel Johnson's original 1952 homestead filing shows ownership of 1,847 acres. The entire Pine Valley development is built on your family's land." The silence in my kitchen was deafening. I didn't just own my cabin, I owned the valley. Karen had been running her scam operation on land that belonged to me. The implications hit me like a freight train. Every property Karen claimed to manage, every house in Pine Valley, the business district where she rented her office, it was all built on Johnson family land. For 70 years, through some bureaucratic oversight, everyone had been living and building on my grandfather's homestead without anyone realizing it. Tom was already calculating the legal ramifications. "Jack, do you understand what this means? You're not just fighting a property scam. You could potentially be the landlord for an entire community." The thought terrified me more than it excited me. I didn't want to be anyone's landlord. I just wanted to grieve in peace. But first, we had to deal with Karen. Tom insisted we confront her immediately, while she still thought she had the upper hand. "We need to do this at her office during business hours, with witnesses present," he said. "Maximum public exposure." Tuesday afternoon, we walked into Pine Valley Management Services on Main Street. The waiting room was packed with 8 clients, which was perfect for our purposes. Karen looked up from her desk with that same professional smile, completely composed. "Mr. Johnson, I trust you've reviewed our payment options. The lien filing deadline is approaching." That's when I dropped the bomb. "Ms. Willis, I need to inform you that you've been operating your business on the Johnson family land. We've owned this entire valley since 1952, including the building you're renting." For the first time since I had met her, Karen's composure cracked. Her smile faltered, and she immediately started shuffling through files on her desk. That's clearly incorrect, Mr. Johnson. Our title research is comprehensive and professionally conducted, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. She grabbed her phone and started making calls, first to the county clerk, then to Pine Valley Title Company. What happened next was like watching someone's entire world collapse in real time. Karen dumped her entire filing cabinet onto the floor, frantically searching for documentation that would prove me wrong. She was muttering under her breath, rechecking numbers, calling out legal statute numbers to no one in particular. This is impossible! I personally verified 70 years of records. Every property, every deed, every transaction. Her voice kept getting higher and more frantic. The clients in her waiting room were staring, some recording with their phones. This polished professional who'd been so confident yesterday was falling apart in front of everyone. Finally, Karen stood up abruptly and started escorting her clients out. I'm sorry, but due to an unexpected legal emergency, we need to reschedule all appointments, she announced, her voice shaking. The office will be closed until further notice. Once everyone was gone, she locked the door, closed the blinds, and just stood there, breathing heavily. Through the window, I could see her pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to stare at papers on her desk. Tom and I exchanged glances. We had definitely rattled her, but something told me this was just the beginning. Karen's assistant, a young woman named Beth, approached us as we left the building. She looked genuinely shaken by what she'd witnessed. I've worked for Karen for 18 months, and I've never seen her lose control like that, Beth whispered. She's always so prepared, always has an answer for everything. Whatever you just told her, it really got to her. Beth glanced around nervously before continuing. Look, I don't know what's going to happen next, but Karen's been acting strange lately. More desperate, more intense. She slipped me a piece of paper with her phone number. If things get weird, call me. I might be able to help. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You have 24 hours to withdraw your claims, or everyone will know what really happened to your mother's money. That text message hit me like a slap in the face. What did Karen know about my mother's money? The medical bills, the insurance settlements, the small inheritance Mom left me. It was all legitimate, all documented. But the fact that Karen even knew about it meant she'd been digging into my personal finances. How deep had her investigation gone? I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. This wasn't just about property anymore. Karen was getting personal. I showed the message to Tom, who immediately advised me to document everything and contact the police. But I knew from yesterday's experience that law enforcement wasn't going to be much help until Karen actually broke a law. Threatening text messages were hard to prove, especially from an untraceable number. Meanwhile, Karen was already launching her counterattack. She had retained Mountain West Genealogy Services on a rush contract to challenge my family's historical land claims. But that wasn't the worst part. Beth called me that evening with disturbing news. Karen had been contacting my relatives in Denver. She's been calling your cousins, claiming there's an estate fraud investigation, Beth explained in a hushed voice. She's using your mother's recent death to gain sympathy, telling them that you're trying to steal family land that doesn't belong to you. The manipulation was brilliant and disgusting. Karen knew I was emotionally vulnerable after losing Mom, and she was weaponizing that grief against me. She was telling my own family that I was the criminal in this situation. Some of them might actually believe her. Grief makes people suspicious of each other, especially when money's involved. But Karen's real genius was her social media campaign. She'd created an online community group called Pine Valley Community Protection Alliance, with the stated mission of protecting local families from property fraud schemes. Her initial post was masterfully crafted. Out-of-state land grabber threatens 200-plus families with bogus property claims. Absent for 8 months, now returns with suspicious documents to steal our homes. Within 48 hours, 127 people had joined the group. She was using my 8-month absence caring for my dying mother as evidence that I'd abandoned the community in their time of need. The social pressure campaign was immediately effective. When I went to Pine Valley Market for groceries, conversation stopped when I walked in. People I'd known for years suddenly couldn't make eye contact. The cashier, someone who used to ask about my mom's health, rang up my items in complete silence. Karen had positioned me as an outsider threatening their community, and it was working. These people didn't know me well enough to question her narrative. To them, I was just some guy from Denver with suspicious legal documents trying to upend their lives. Thursday evening, Karen organized what she called an emergency community meeting at Pine Valley Methodist Church. She didn't invite me, but Mike heard about it and insisted we show up anyway. Walking into that church felt like entering hostile territory. 63 residents packed the pews, and the temperature in the room dropped it when they saw me. Karen stood at the pulpit like she was delivering a sermon, complete with a PowerPoint presentation and handouts. "Friends and neighbors," she began, "we're facing an unprecedented threat to our community's stability and property values." Her presentation was carefully staged. She cued a reel of neighbor testimonials on a tablet, scrolled through maintenance logs with dates and costs, and framed herself as the dedicated local businesswoman, protecting everyone from outside threats. "Jack Johnson abandoned us for 8 months while we dealt with maintenance issues, security concerns, and property value fluctuations," she declared. "Now he returns with suspicious legal documents, claiming ownership of land that's been peacefully settled for decades. Are we going to let an outsider destroy our community with frivolous legal challenges?" The crowd murmured agreement, and several people actually applauded. When I tried to speak, explaining that I had been caring for my dying mother, the hostility was palpable. "Convenient excuse," someone shouted from the back. "Why should we believe anything you say?" Karen had done her homework. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. She'd turned my greatest sacrifice, caring for Mom during her final months, into evidence of my supposed abandonment of the community. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Tom and I left that meeting feeling completely isolated. Karen had successfully positioned herself as David fighting Goliath, and I was the giant trying to crush their little community. But Karen wasn't finished. Over the next few days, she launched a door-to-door campaign, visiting every property owner with what she called community protection packets. And these professional-looking folders contained legal documents, property value assessments, and warnings about the dangers of frivolous land claims. She was particularly effective with elderly residents who remembered disputes over land rights from decades past. "Mrs. Patterson, you've lived here for 30 years, she'd say. "Are you going to let some stranger from Denver take away everything you've worked for?" Mike was caught in the middle of all this. Karen approached him with an offer to become neighborhood watch coordinator, complete with an official title and small monthly stipend. She knew he was my friend, and she was trying to turn him against me, or at least neutralize his support. She offered me $500 a month to help monitor suspicious activity in the neighborhood, Mike told me. When I asked what kind of suspicious activity, she just smiled and said I'd know it when I saw it. Mike declined, but the fact that she'd tried to buy him off showed how seriously she was taking this fight. The only person openly supporting me was 75-year-old Rose Carter, who'd lived in Pine Valley since 1970. Rose remembered my grandfather, Samuel Johnson, and insisted that he was a good man who wouldn't want this kind of division in his community. More importantly, Rose suggested I check the old survey documents in her basement. She'd been collecting local historical documents for decades and thought she might have relevant paperwork about the original land grants. It was a long shot, but at this point, I needed all the help I could get. Meanwhile, Beth continued providing inside intelligence about Karen's operations. "She's spending her daughter's college fund on legal research," Beth reported during a secret meeting at Pine Valley Diner. "She hired Stevenson and Associates, those expensive property lawyers from Denver. She's also been mentioning something about federal jurisdiction overriding state records. I don't know what that means, but she seems really confident about it. The federal angle worried me. If Karen found a way to bring federal authorities into this dispute, she could potentially invalidate everyone's property claims, not just mine. By the end of the week, the community was completely divided. 40-plus residents had signed Karen's community protection petition, demanding that I withdraw my fraudulent land claims. About 20 more were taking a wait-and-see approach, wanting more information before choosing sides. Only Mike and Rose were openly supporting me. Karen had successfully isolated me and positioned herself as the community's protector. But Rose's mention of basement documents gave me hope. Maybe Grandpa Samuel had left behind evidence that could end this fight once and for all. Rose finds Samuel Johnson's personal papers in basement storage, including a 1974 letter mentioning finally resolved that federal boundary survey mess from 1962. What would you do if your entire community turned against you? Have you ever had to fight for something when everyone thought you were wrong? Let me know in the comments. Your stories help me understand how real people handle these impossible situations. Rose's basement was like stepping into Pine Valley's secret history. Boxes of old documents, photographs, and correspondence filled every corner, organized by decade in her meticulous handwriting. But it was Samuel Johnson's 1974 letter that stopped me cold. Finally got that federal boundary survey mess from 1962 straightened out with the Forest Service. Should prevent any future problems with property claims. My grandfather had dealt with federal land disputes before, and somehow resolved them. This wasn't just about county records. There were federal implications I hadn't even considered. Armed with this new information, Tom and I realized we needed to get ahead of Karen's narrative before she controlled the entire story. Karen had proven she was a master manipulator, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She was so confident in her legal maneuvering that she'd agreed to a joint television interview. Channel 7 News wanted to cover the community property dispute, and Karen jumped at the chance for free publicity. She probably thought she could embarrass me on live television and end this fight permanently. She had no idea what we'd discovered. But first, I had to deal with Karen's escalating harassment campaign. She'd hired a local PR consultant using money she'd borrowed against her daughter's college fund, according to Beth's intelligence reports. The woman was spending money she didn't have to destroy my reputation, which told me just how desperate she'd become. Her new professional website, Community Management Solutions, had transformed her from a simple property manager into a community advocate, fighting for local families against corporate land grabs. The rebranding was subtle but effective. She was positioning this as a David versus Goliath story, with me as the corporate villain. Karen's media strategy was sophisticated. She'd arranged interviews with 3 different local outlets, each time bringing character witnesses who testified to her integrity and community service. The Pine Valley Gazette ran a front-page story titled "Local Woman Stands Up to Property Fraud Scheme," with scenes of Karen at community events and brisk quotes from clients. On air, she relied on time-stamped service logs and short clips from neighborhood projects to sell the same story of community enhancement versus outside interference. When Channel 7's news crew arrived for our joint interview, Karen came prepared for battle. She arrived with 2 character witnesses and a tablet loaded with clips from block parties and cleanup days, a quiet message about who really belonged to this community. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, set up the interview in Pine Valley's town square with the mountain backdrop. Karen spoke first, and I have to admit she was compelling. I've dedicated 3 years of my life to protecting property values and maintaining community standards in Pine Valley, she said, looking directly into the camera. Now we're facing an unprecedented threat from someone who abandoned this community for 8 months and returns with suspicious legal documents. She was good, really good. Karen spoke with the passion of someone who genuinely believed she was protecting her neighbors from a con artist. She presented her business licenses, insurance certificates, and community service awards as evidence in a trial. These aren't just legal documents, she explained. They represent my commitment to this community and the families who trust me to protect their most valuable assets. The reporter was clearly sympathetic, nodding along as Karen painted herself as the responsible local businesswoman fighting against outside manipulation. Then it was my turn. Tom and I had prepared carefully for this moment. Instead of attacking Karen personally, I focused on documented facts. I presented the authenticated property deeds, the county clerk's confirmation of my family's ownership, and most importantly, Rose's historical documents proving my grandfather had dealt with similar disputes decades earlier. My family has owned this land since 1952, I said calmly. The county records confirm this, the historical documents support it, and I have witnesses who remember my grandfather resolving these exact issues in the 1970s. That's when Karen's composure started cracking. When Jessica asked her to respond to the authenticated county records, Karen's voice got noticeably higher. Documents can be fabricated by anyone with enough money, she said, but uncertainty flickered across her face. I've spent 3 years building a legitimate business protecting this community. She stood up suddenly, pointing at the camera. This is a coordinated attack against honest people trying to make a living. The change in her demeanor was dramatic, from composed professional to agitated defender in 30 seconds. But the breaking point came when Jessica asked about the 1974 letter from my grandfather. Karen's eyes widened as she realized there was evidence she hadn't accounted for. That document could be forged too, she stammered, but her voice cracked. You can't destroy honest people with fake papers. She was shouting now, her carefully constructed public image crumbling in real time. I've spent 3 years protecting this community. The camera kept rolling as Karen ripped off her microphone and stormed away from the interview, leaving me alone to explain calmly what had just happened. The footage went viral within hours. Karen's on-camera breakdown was shared across social media platforms, with comments ranging from sympathy to embarrassment to outright mockery. The hashtag karenmeltdown started trending locally, and suddenly her professional image was shattered. Several of her clients called that evening to cancel their management contracts. The Pine Valley Community Protection Alliance group saw dozens of members leave, and the supportive comments on her posts turned critical. People who had supported her at the church meeting were now questioning whether they'd backed the wrong horse. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. That same evening, she posted what she called an apology video on her business page, claiming she'd been ambushed by biased journalism and unfair editing. "I'm under tremendous stress from frivolous legal harassment," she explained, trying to reclaim the victim narrative. "My emotional response today reflects the pressure I'm feeling to protect families who are depending on me." But the damage was done. The comments section was brutal, and the video received 3 times as many dislikes as likes. People could see through her attempt to spin the breakdown as righteous indignation. The interview aftermath revealed how precarious Karen's position really was. According to Beth, who called me that night, Karen had spent the entire evening making frantic phone calls to lawyers, PR consultants, and even private investigators. "She's talking about hiring someone to dig deeper into your personal life," Beth warned. She mentioned something about finding the real story behind your mother's money and exposing the truth about your absence. "Jack, I think she's getting dangerous." The escalation from a property dispute to a personal vendetta was concerning. Karen wasn't just fighting for money anymore. She was fighting for her reputation, her business, and possibly her sanity. What scared me most was the calculating look in her eyes during those final moments of the interview. Even as she was losing control publicly, I could see her mind working, planning her next move. Karen wasn't the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. If legal maneuvering and public relations couldn't destroy me, what would she try next? The answer came sooner than I expected. That night, Mike calls Jack in panic. "Get out of the cabin. Now. I just saw Karen's car parked at the end of your driveway with the headlights off." Mike's phone call sent ice through my veins. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully looked out my bedroom window toward the driveway. Sure enough, there was a dark sedan parked about 50 yards down the road, with its engine running but headlights off. In the moonlight, I could make out someone sitting in the driver's seat, just watching my cabin. This wasn't casual surveillance. This was intimidation. Karen was escalating from legal warfare to psychological harassment, and frankly it was working. I felt trapped in my own home. I called Mike back and asked him to keep watch while I figured out my next move. 20 minutes later, the car disappeared without its lights ever coming on. Whoever was driving knew these mountain roads well enough to navigate them in the dark. The message was clear. Karen could get to me any time she wanted. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound the old cabin made. By morning, I was exhausted and paranoid, exactly how Karen wanted me to feel. But when I checked my security system footage, I discovered something that changed everything. The timestamp showed someone had approached my cabin at 2:47 a.m., 11 minutes after the car disappeared. Using Mike's retired cop expertise, we analyzed the grainy footage frame by frame. "That's definitely Karen," Mike confirmed, pointing to the figure's distinctive left shoulder movement. "She has a slight limp from a car accident 5 years ago. I remember processing that insurance claim." The footage showed her using some kind of tool to jimmy open my back door, spending exactly 11 minutes inside, then leaving the same way she came. She'd planted something in my cabin while her accomplice kept watch from the road. What we found made my blood boil. Hidden in my desk drawer were 3 handwritten letters supposedly from me to Karen, each crafted to sound more unhinged than the last. The forgery was sophisticated. Whoever created these had studied my handwriting carefully, and even incorporated personal details that only someone with access to my private information could know. The letters reference my mother's medical treatment, my financial struggles, even the specific insurance settlements from her estate. "You're going to pay for what you've done to my family," one letter read. "People like you don't deserve to live in peace." Karen had filed a restraining order that morning, using these planted letters as evidence that I was escalating to violence due to failed fraud schemes. The Pine County Courthouse scheduled an emergency hearing for Friday afternoon. If the restraining order was granted, I wouldn't be able to access my own property. Karen's strategy was diabolical. create evidence of threats she could use to legally remove me from the equation. Tom was furious when I showed him the forged letters. "This is evidence tampering, breaking and entering, and harassment," he said. "But proving she planted these is going to be difficult without clear video evidence." That's when Beth called, with information that changed the entire scope of our fight. "Karen's been researching federal land surveys from the 1960s, she whispered during our secret meeting at Pine Valley Diner. "She found something in National Forest Service archives that she thinks gives her leverage over everyone, not just you." Beth looked genuinely scared as she continued. She contacted the Forest Service regional office about what she called private property encroachment on federal land. "Jack, she's not just challenging your ownership anymore. She's trying to get the federal government to claim jurisdiction over the entire valley." The implications hit me like a freight train. If Karen could convince federal authorities that there were legitimate boundary disputes between private property and national forest land, she could potentially invalidate everyone's property deeds. It was a scorched earth strategy. If she couldn't have control over Pine Valley, she'd destroy the entire community's property rights and start over. Tom immediately started researching federal land law, while I tried to process the magnitude of what Karen was attempting. She's not just desperate, I realized. She's a genius. An evil genius, but still brilliant. According to Beth's intelligence, Karen had discovered 1962 Forest Service archives showing potential boundary confusion between private homestead claims and federal land. The documents suggested that some of the original surveys might have been incorrect, creating overlapping jurisdictions that were never properly resolved. Karen's plan was to use these discrepancies to challenge all private ownership in Pine Valley, positioning herself as the solution to the chaos she'd created. If federal authorities assert jurisdiction, state property deeds become meaningless, Tom explained grimly. She could potentially displace 200 families and start fresh with federal land management contracts. The U.S. Forest Service announcement came Tuesday morning. Formal boundary investigation affecting Pine Valley property owners. Every resident received certified mail requiring them to appear at a mandatory hearing to demonstrate legitimate ownership under federal jurisdiction review. The panic was immediate and intense. Property owners who'd been living peacefully for decades suddenly faced the possibility of losing their homes to federal land seizure. Karen's social media group exploded with activity as people demanded answers, solutions, and someone to blame, and Karen was ready with all three. Her latest post positioned the federal investigation as the inevitable result of my fraudulent land claims triggering government scrutiny. She wrote, "This is exactly what I warned everyone about. Jack Johnson's suspicious legal maneuvering has attracted federal attention that threatens every family in our community. Now we're all paying the price for his greed and deception." The narrative was perfect. I had caused this crisis, and Karen was the only one qualified to solve it. Dozens of people who had been neutral in our dispute suddenly turned against me. Tom's legal research revealed just how precarious everyone's situation had become. Federal land jurisdiction supersedes state property law, he explained. If the Forest Service decides there are legitimate boundary disputes, they can essentially void any conflicting private ownership claims and assert federal control. The 1974 letter from my grandfather took on new significance. He'd apparently resolved similar federal boundary issues decades earlier, but the documentation of that resolution might have been lost in government bureaucratic shuffles over the years. The community meeting that Thursday night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The Pine Valley High School gymnasium was packed with terrified property owners demanding answers. Karen stood at the podium, looking like a wartime leader addressing her troops. "Friends, we're facing an existential threat to our community," she declared. "Federal bureaucrats are questioning our right to live in homes we've owned for decades. But I've spent 3 years building relationships with government officials, understanding regulatory requirements, and protecting property rights. If we work together, I can guide us through this crisis." The applause was thunderous. People were scared, confused, and looking for someone to blame and someone to save them. Karen provided both. I was the villain who'd triggered federal scrutiny, and she was the hero who could navigate government bureaucracy. Several families approached her after the meeting, offering to pay her management fees if she could protect them from federal seizure. She was turning a crisis of her own creation into a massive business opportunity. As Jack reviews the planted evidence with Tom, he notices something that makes him freeze. One of the threatening letters contains a detail only 3 people in the world could possibly know. Staring at that forged letter, my heart stopped. Buried in the third paragraph was a reference to my mother's final words, something she'd whispered to me in the hospital just hours before she died. "Tell them the mountain remembers everything." It was a cryptic phrase that only made sense because Mom had been heavily medicated and drifting in and out of consciousness. I'd never told anyone about those words, never written them down, never even understood what she meant. Only 3 people could possibly know: me, Mom, and whoever had been listening outside her hospital room that night. The realization hit like a physical blow. Karen hadn't just been researching my property claims and financial records. She'd been stalking me during the most vulnerable moment of my life. While I sat beside my dying mother's bed, grieving and exhausted, Karen was lurking in hospital corridors, gathering intelligence she could use against me months later. The violation felt even worse than the property scam. She'd weaponized my mother's final moments, turning sacred words into evidence for a forged death threat. Tom saw my expression and immediately knew we'd discovered something significant. "She was there," I whispered, showing him the letter. Karen was at Denver General Hospital the night my mother died. She heard Mom's last words and somehow incorporated them into this fake threat. Tom's face went white as he understood the implications. "Jack, this proves premeditation. She's been planning this for months, maybe even before your mother passed away. This isn't just property fraud, it's psychological warfare." We immediately called the Pine County Sheriff, but Deputy Miller seemed more interested in the federal investigation than Karen's escalating harassment. "Sir, with all due respect, we've got bigger problems right now. The Forest Service wants to interview everyone about land ownership. Your personal dispute with Miss Willis will have to wait." Meanwhile, Karen was orchestrating what she called Save Pine Valley as a countywide live stream. Instead of a packed gym, she broadcast from a small studio set, reading curated questions on air, while a scrolling chat filled with familiar names cheered her on. The format let her control angles, pacing, and who got to speak, and on camera she looked composed and unflappable. "Friends and neighbors," Karen began, her voice carrying across the packed gymnasium, "we're not just facing a threat to our property rights. We're fighting for our community's very existence." Her speech was masterfully crafted, hitting every emotional button. She talked about families who'd lived in Pine Valley for generations, children who'd grown up playing in these mountains, elderly residents who'd planned to retire peacefully in their homes. "The federal government is questioning our right to exist here because one person's fraudulent legal claims attracted unwanted government attention." The crowd ate it up. When Karen presented Pine County Commissioner Brad Walsh, who gave her an official Community Service Recognition Award, the applause lasted 3 full minutes. Mayor Jennifer Santos endorsed Karen's grassroots community advocacy, and the Pine Valley Gazette photographer captured every moment. Karen had successfully positioned herself as the community's official representative in their fight against federal overreach. She wasn't just a property manager anymore. She was their leader, their voice, their salvation. When I tried to attend the rally, the hostility was overwhelming. People who had known me for years turned their backs when I walked in. Someone actually threw a coffee cup in my direction, and Mike had to escort me out for my own safety. "Go back to Denver," someone shouted. "Stop destroying our community." The crowd's anger felt genuinely dangerous. Karen had successfully convinced them that I was personally responsible for putting their homes at risk. From their perspective, I was the outsider who'd triggered a federal investigation that could destroy their lives. But while Karen was basking in community adoration, Tom was racing against time to save everyone's property rights. His research had revealed that my grandfather's 1974 boundary resolution existed in the Colorado State Archives, but had never been properly filed with federal authorities. The original surveyor had noted sending copies to both state and federal offices, but the federal copy was apparently lost during a 1983 Denver office consolidation. If we could get that correction into federal records before the hearing, it would resolve all boundary disputes in my favor. The bureaucratic requirements were nightmarish. Federal court filing needed 72 hours advance notice, and we only had 48 hours until the hearing. Tom spent an entire day on the phone with archive directors, court clerks, and federal administrators trying to expedite the process. Meanwhile, Rose's basement documents provided crucial evidence. Her collection included surveyors' personal notes confirming that the boundary correction had been mailed to Forest Service Regional Office under file number FS 1974 C0447. Mike volunteered for the most crucial mission. Using his 30 years of law enforcement connections, he drove 6 hours to Denver for emergency document retrieval from the state archives. I failed this community by staying silent when Karen started her operation, he told me. I'm not failing again. And Mike's guilt over not warning me about Karen's initial approach had been eating at him for months. This was his chance at redemption, and he approached it with military precision. While Mike was racing to Denver, Karen was holding a pre-hearing press conference with full community backing. Local news cameras captured her, surrounded by supporters, looking confident and professional. Tomorrow, federal officials will expose these fraudulent property manipulation schemes once and for all, she declared. Our community has endured months of harassment and legal intimidation, but justice will prevail. She had already scheduled what she called a community victory party for Saturday evening, complete with catered food and live music. Karen was so confident in her federal strategy that she was celebrating before the hearing even began. But Tom's legal team had been working around the clock. When Mike returned from Denver with certified copies of the 1974 boundary correction, we had exactly 18 hours to complete the federal filing process. Tom's law clerk drove through the night to file the documents with the U.S. District Court in Denver, arriving with just 4 hours to spare before the mandatory notification deadline. We'd gotten the boundary correction into federal records, but Karen had no idea what was coming. The night before the federal hearing, I couldn't sleep. Everything, my family's land, the community's future, Karen's elaborate scheme, would be decided in a few hours. I kept thinking about my grandfather's letter, mentioning the Federal Boundary Survey mess from 1962. He'd dealt with government bureaucracy and territorial disputes decades before I was born, somehow finding a way to protect our family's land rights. Tomorrow, I'd discover whether his efforts would save us all, or whether Karen's manipulation had doomed an entire community. Beth called with final intelligence about Karen's state of mind. She's been up all night reviewing federal land law and practicing her presentation, Beth reported. She's convinced she's about to win the biggest victory of her career. Jack, I've never seen her this confident about anything. She really believes she's got you beat. That confidence worried me more than anything else. Karen had proven herself to be a master strategist who rarely miscalculated. What did she know that we didn't? Tom successfully files the 1974 boundary correction with the U.S. District Court with exactly 4 hours to spare. Karen's team has no knowledge of this development. Have you ever been in a situation where everything seemed hopeless until the very last moment? Sometimes the biggest victories come when we're closest to losing everything. Share your own comeback stories below. I read every single comment, and they inspire me to keep fighting the good fight. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver was packed beyond capacity, with an overflow crowd gathering outside on the courthouse steps. News crews from 3 different stations had set up equipment, treating this like the major story it had become. Karen arrived in a black sedan with a small entourage of Pine Valley supporters, looking every inch the community leader, fighting for her neighbors' rights. She wore a professional charcoal suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The confidence radiating from her was almost intimidating. She walked like someone who had already won. Inside the courtroom, Federal Judge Patricia Hendricks called the hearing to order with stern efficiency. The gallery was filled with Pine Valley residents, federal officials, and more media than I'd ever seen in one room. Karen's supporters occupied most of the seating, many wearing Save Pine Valley buttons and holding signs demanding federal protection from property fraud. The atmosphere felt like a political rally more than a legal proceeding. Karen had successfully framed this as a community fighting for survival against a predatory outsider, and the optics were entirely in her favor. Karen's opening presentation was nothing short of masterful. She stood before Judge Hendricks with the poise of a seasoned attorney, speaking clearly and passionately about community protection and federal oversight responsibilities. Your Honor, the Pine Valley community represents exactly the kind of rural stability that federal land management was designed to protect, she began. For months, we've endured harassment from fraudulent property claims that threaten not just individual families, but the entire social fabric of our mountain community. She presented her research methodically: the 1962 boundary confusion, the incomplete surveys, the potential overlap between private claims and national forest jurisdiction. Her community testimony was devastating to my case. Resident after resident took the stand praising Karen's professional protection, and expressing fear about losing their homes to my suspicious legal maneuvering. An elderly woman named Margaret Patterson spoke about living peacefully in Pine Valley for 32 years, only to face displacement because of my out-of-state property grab. A young father described his terror at potentially losing the home where his children had learned to walk and ride bicycles. Karen had coached them perfectly. Each testimony reinforced the narrative that I was a wealthy outsider using legal technicalities to destroy a close-knit community. But the most compelling part of Karen's presentation was the way she narrated trends. She pointed to charts of reported complaints declining at the properties she managed, held up maintenance timelines, and spoke about response times as if they were case law. These documents represent 3 years of dedicated service to Pine Valley families, she explained to Judge Hendricks. Every property I manage shows improved maintenance, increased value, and enhanced community standards. This isn't just about legal ownership, it's about responsible stewardship of mountain resources. The gallery applauded until Judge Hendricks called for order. When it was our turn, Tom stood up with quiet confidence and approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to present recently filed federal documentation that resolves all boundary disputes in this case. Karen's head snapped up with the first sign of concern I'd seen all day. Tom handed certified copies of my grandfather's 1974 boundary correction to the court clerk, along with the federal filing receipts from our emergency submission. This documentation, properly filed with this court 4 hours ago, confirms complete resolution of any federal boundary disputes affecting Pine Valley properties. The federal surveyor who testified next destroyed Karen's entire legal foundation. David Morrison from the U.S. Geological Survey reviewed the 1974 correction documents with professional authority. Based on this comprehensive boundary resolution, all private property claims in Pine Valley are legitimate and properly documented, he stated clearly. The 1962 survey discrepancies were thoroughly investigated and resolved. There are no outstanding federal jurisdiction conflicts affecting any properties in the Pine Valley development. That's when I watched Karen's world collapse in real time. The color drained from her face as she realized her federal strategy had just been completely demolished. She started shuffling through papers frantically, whispering urgently to the community representatives sitting behind her. Her breathing became noticeably faster, and her hands were actually shaking as she tried to organize her documents. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen looked genuinely panicked. The professional composure she'd maintained through months of legal warfare was finally cracking under federal scrutiny. Judge Hendricks asked Karen if she had any response to the federal surveyor's testimony. That's when everything fell apart. Karen stood up, but her voice was different, higher, strained, desperate. Your Honor, this filing violates proper notice procedures, she protested. These documents appeared overnight without adequate time for review or challenge. But Judge Hendricks had already verified that all filing requirements had been met. That's when Karen lost it completely. I researched 70 years of records, she shouted, pointing at me across the courtroom. This is procedural fraud designed to protect his criminal property schemes. The gallery fell silent as Karen's professional mask finally slipped entirely. Judge Hendricks called for order, but Karen was beyond hearing. You're being deceived by forged documents, she screamed, advancing toward the court clerk's table. The courtroom erupted as Karen tried to grab the federal documents from the clerk's table. 2 bailiffs immediately moved to restrain her while she fought against them, still screaming about fraud and deception. Delete these records, she shouted as they pulled her back. My community needs protection from criminals like him. The news cameras captured every moment of the breakdown, and I could see Karen's supporters in the gallery looking horrified as their champion devolved into a ranting conspiracy theorist before their eyes. But even as the bailiffs were restraining her, Karen's eyes found mine across the courtroom. The look she gave me was pure hatred, not the calculating manipulation I'd grown used to, but genuine malice that made my skin crawl. This isn't over, Johnson, she snarled as they led her toward the door. You have no idea what you've started. Judge Hendricks immediately held her in contempt of court and ordered a federal investigation into her property management business practices. The legal consequences came swiftly and brutally. Federal prosecutors announced they were opening a fraud investigation based on Karen's courtroom behavior and the evidence of forged documents. Her business licenses were immediately suspended, pending investigation. The state attorney general's office began reviewing complaints from her other clients across 3 counties. Pine County Sheriff's Department finally took the harassment charges seriously and issued warrants for breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and stalking. Karen's entire operation collapsed in a single afternoon. But more than the legal destruction, it was the community reaction that truly ended Karen's reign. Her supporters sat in stunned silence as they realized they'd been manipulated by someone who was either genuinely delusional or criminally sophisticated. People who'd defended her for months were now questioning everything she'd told them. Margaret Patterson, who'd testified so passionately about losing her home, approached me after the hearing with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "She convinced us you were the threat." We had no idea she was lying about everything. The Pine Valley Community Protection Alliance dissolved that evening. Karen's business office was sealed by federal marshals, and her assets were frozen pending restitution calculations. Beth finally felt safe enough to provide investigators with documentation of Karen's illegal activities. The woman who'd controlled Pine Valley through fear and manipulation was facing 3 years in federal prison and financial ruin. As Karen is led away in federal custody, she stops at the courthouse door and turns back to Jack with a smile that chills everyone watching. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you've started." 1 year later, Pine Valley had transformed into something my grandfather Samuel would have been proud of. The community that Karen had divided through fear and manipulation now operated on principles of transparency and cooperation. What started as a property scam had accidentally created the strongest, most unified neighborhood I'd ever seen. Sometimes the best things emerge from the worst situations, and Pine Valley was living proof of that truth. Karen's sentencing had been swift and comprehensive. Federal Judge Hendricks gave her 3 years in minimum security prison, full restitution to 23 victims across 3 counties totaling $114,000, and permanent prohibition from any property management activities. The fraud investigation revealed that Karen's operation was even more extensive than we'd realized. She'd been targeting abandoned properties throughout rural Colorado, always focusing on areas with complex land ownership histories. Her sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic loopholes had allowed her to steal from families during their most vulnerable moments. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed Karen's complicated motivations. She wasn't just a simple con artist. She genuinely believed she was providing valuable services to communities that couldn't protect themselves. Her background in municipal planning had given her insider knowledge of property regulations, but losing custody of her daughter had triggered a desperate need to prove her worth through control and authority. The therapist described it as savior complex combined with narcissistic manipulation. Karen saw herself as the hero of every story, even when she was clearly the villain. Beth had emerged as an unlikely community leader during the transition period. Her months of secretly working against Karen while maintaining her cover had taught her the difference between authentic service and manipulative control. "Working for Karen showed me how someone could use people's trust against them," Beth explained during a community meeting. Real leadership means transparency, accountability, and actually listening to what people need rather than telling them what they should want. The residents elected Beth as the first president of the Pine Valley Community Association, a voluntary organization focused on genuine mutual aid. Mike Stevens channeled his guilt over initially enabling Karen's operation into something positive. He established the Rural Property Protection Program in partnership with the Pine County Sheriff's Department, providing education about property scams targeting rural communities. "I knew something felt wrong about Karen's pitch 2 years ago, but I stayed silent because it wasn't directly affecting me," Mike explained during his first workshop. "That silence enabled her to hurt my neighbors and friends." His program had already prevented 3 similar scams in neighboring counties. The property arrangements I worked out with Pine Valley residents became a model for ethical land management. Instead of Karen's expensive and mandatory management fees, I offered voluntary lease agreements at 50% below market rate, with all revenue going directly into community improvements like road maintenance, snow removal, and emergency services. Families could choose to participate or maintain their properties independently. No pressure, no manipulation, no fear-based marketing. Rose had become the unofficial community historian, preserving the authentic stories that Karen had tried to manipulate for her own purposes. Her basement archives became a proper historical collection housed in the community center we established in Karen's former office building. Karen understood that controlling the narrative means controlling the community, Rose observed. But real history is messier and more honest than any story one person can create. The federal case created legal precedents protecting other rural communities from similar schemes. The Department of Justice published guidelines helping law enforcement identify sophisticated property management fraud, using Karen's operation as the primary case study. Tom testified before Congress about regulatory gaps that enabled Karen's scheme, leading to legislation requiring stricter oversight of property management companies in rural areas. The most surprising development was Karen's transformation in prison. According to her daughter Ashley, Karen was finally receiving proper mental health treatment for the first time in years. Mom admits now that she lost perspective somewhere along the way, Ashley shared during a community meeting. She started believing her own stories about protecting people, even when she was clearly hurting them. Ashley was using her mother's college fund to study social work, determined to help people in healthy ways her mother never learned. Pine Valley's property values had actually increased by 25% since Karen's arrest, despite her predictions of economic disaster. The community's reputation for cooperation and transparency attracted new residents looking for authentic mountain living rather than manufactured management solutions. The Pine Valley Community Association's quarterly newsletters featured real stories from residents, practical information, and honest discussions about challenges and solutions. The transformation extended beyond Pine Valley itself. Karen's former clients from other communities reached out for advice about transitioning from manipulative management to authentic cooperation. The Pine Valley model was being replicated across rural Colorado. What started as one woman's sophisticated scam had accidentally created a blueprint for ethical community organization. On quiet evenings, I often sat on my deck looking out over the valley my grandfather had protected for future generations. The land itself holds the true stories, the authentic relationships, the real history that manipulators can temporarily obscure but never permanently erase. Karen had tried to rewrite Pine Valley's story to serve her needs, but the mountain's memory was longer and stronger than any individual's ambition. The community center displayed a simple plaque dedicating the building to authentic service over manufactured crisis, cooperation over manipulation, and truth over convenient fiction. Karen's former office had become a symbol of redemption. The same space where she'd tried to control people through fear now hosted potluck dinners, children's programs, and community meetings where everyone had an equal voice. Looking back, I realized that fighting Karen had taught me something valuable about the difference between winning and justice. Winning would have been exposing her fraud quickly and getting her arrested before she could hurt anyone else. Justice was the slower process of helping an entire community learn to trust authentically after being manipulated systematically. Pine Valley didn't just recover from Karen's scheme. We became stronger, more connected, and more resilient because we'd faced a crisis together and chosen cooperation over control. That's the incredible story of Karen's property war here on Echo Stories. If this tale of justice and community triumph resonated with you, smash that like button. I'll see you in the next video with another unbelievable story. Until then, take care.